when I was nominated for this, obviously being nominated by your students is probably the biggest honor that you can have. So I don't know who nominated me, but whoever did, I really, really, really appreciate that. It's a little bit of an ominous title, The Last Lecture. Like, is this the last lecture I'm ever going to give? I've been giving them for a long time, as you can probably tell. I found a little story about a professor that asked a student, how would you define what a lecturer is? And the student responded by saying that a lecturer is a person that has a bad habit of speaking when other people are trying to sleep. So I hope I don't put anybody to sleep today, but I do think that's a pretty fitting description. And so as my lectures go in class, I always felt like to be an effective instructor, it has to be more of a story than a lecture. And so I thought today, rather than doing a lecture on a topic maybe that I know a little bit about, or something in engineering or new technology or something like that, I thought I would just tell a little bit of a story. So this story is kind of, as you go through life and as you go through your career, you meet people that influence you in different ways. And so I decided to talk about some of those people that are my characters, and some of them were really characters. And so I'd like to tell you about some of those people. And I've told these stories, when I was thinking through this, I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to say and who am I going to talk about? Almost all of these people that I'm going to speak about are people that I've spoken about in my classroom for pretty much forever, and they all fit into some subject somewhere. And so I just thought that would be a good way to go. So I'm going to start out with a childhood friend, and I think I have a document here that I'm going to share so you can see. So here's my childhood friend. Some people would say he looks a little bit like Willie Nelson, and he's had a little bit of a life like Willie Nelson too. But anyway, that's Hugh McMillan Kerr. What a name, right? And so Hugh was known to his friends as Mackie. That was his name. And he was a neighborhood friend. So he grew up on the next street from me. He was the youngest of 3 children, and his parents were older. So he was by far the youngest. His brother was about 10, 11 years older than him. And so, by the time he was middle school age, that age, his parents were by far the oldest parents of any of our friends. And so Mac was the kind of kid that he was always into something. Very active kid, very engaged in the neighborhood, but he was also one of those kids that you could pretty much talk into anything. And so I have vivid memories of him coming down to my house on, say, a Sunday morning after church. And we lived in a small town in New Jersey, and we still had some dirt roads in the town when I was a child. And we happened to have one of those dirt roads right next to my house. And Mac would come down on Sunday morning after church, and he'd still have his Sunday suit on. And, that road was one of those roads that never really ever dried out. There always seemed to be some water or some mud puddles there. And it wouldn't take too long to one of the older kids, it would either be my brother or one of his friends, would talk Mackie into venturing into that mud puddle. And sure enough, he'd go in, he'd either sit in it or walk through it or whatever. And then he'd get home and, he'd get a bit of a spanking there, and he'd come back and do it again the very next week. So that's the type of person he was. When he was in 7th grade, his father died, and his mother decided that she was going to move out of our town and move closer to some of her relatives. And Mackie really didn't want to go, and he was pretty devastated by the whole thing. And myself and my other friends, we were a little bit of Mackie's compass. He could definitely go off in different directions, and we always were kind of, the little voice in his ear. Is that the smartest thing to do, Mac? Maybe we better think that through. And we were all a little concerned when he, decided, or he didn't decide, his mother decided that he had to move away from us. So after he moved, and it wasn't that far, it was maybe 20, 25 miles away, but when you're in 7th grade, that's 1,000,000 miles. So you might as well be on the other side of the planet. So he moved away, and when he moved there, he started to get involved with, some other people who didn't have his best interests in mind. And so sure enough, at about 16, he was arrested, I think, and it might have been a minor drug thing or something like that. And when that happened, his mother had, I guess she kind of reached her end, and she kicked him out of the house when he was 16 years old. So 16 years old, Mackie was living in a cardboard bicycle box out behind the bike shop that would let him work there every once in a while. And he lived in that box for about a year. And you know, we would talk on the phone now and then. And he, you know, I'd say, well, how you getting money, Mackie? He'd say, well, you know, I panhandle. I go to the mall. I ask people for money. He said, on a good day, I can make $20 or something like that. And they let me work in the shop a little bit. So in all the things that had gone wrong, he had moved, he'd been kicked out of the house. I think at this time he was pretty truant from school most of the time. You know, he still was like, oh, yeah, I'm getting along. I got a little money, and you know, I can always get a new box. The shop's right there. So when this one gets wet, I just get a new box. And you couldn't help but thinking, God, this poor kid, he's in the worst of worlds, but he's still finding something in that existence that makes him smile every day. Mackie had a brother, John, who was actually my brother's age. So again, he was 10 years older. And so I think eventually his mother decided to move to Florida, and she kind of contacted him and said, I'm moving and you're not welcome to come. So he went and moved in with his brother, John. John lived in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey in a house that was really away from everything. There wasn't really anything down there. And John's wife really didn't like Mackie very much. So she said, okay, he can stay here, but he has to stay in the attic. Now, this wasn't your typical attic in a big old house, right? This was a ranch house. It was an attic that was basically 6 foot of space that, you know, that's where you store your Christmas trees and stuff like that. And that's where he lived. So he literally would have to get on a ladder in the garage and go up and go through his little, and they would let him use the bathroom. And he lived there for a while, and then John's wife left him. And John was not a very industrious person, didn't have a job. That was probably why his wife left him. So basically it's John and Mackie now living in this house, but they have no means of income. So first the water got shut off, and then the electricity got shut off. And of course they weren't paying their mortgage payment. So eventually they got kicked out of that house. They got evicted. And so Mac had made friends in that neighborhood, and one of the friends that he made was a girl down the street, and he kind of liked her. So he wanted to kind of hang around, but he really had no place to stay. So that winter, and I think at this time Mac's about maybe 17 years old, I don't know, something like that. He was literally living in a tent out behind this young lady's house. And I remember that vividly because it was so cold. It was one of those really, really bitter winters. And I'm thinking, how can somebody stay in a tent in weather like this? And again, you know, this is way before cell phones, so we didn't get to talk to him too often. But you know, every once in a while he'd make it to a phone and call one of us, or we would call him in one way or another. And you know, again, it's not like he's boo-hooing. It's not like he's going, oh, I have the worst life in the world. It was like, yeah, I'm living out in the tent. It's a little cold, but you know, I get to see my girlfriend every day, so it's okay. So eventually the girl got pregnant, and so the father sort of insisted that Mackie marry her. And so he did. And they had a kind of a little farm is where this girl lived. And so after they got married, the father said, okay, I'll fix you up a little place to live. So basically he fixed up the chicken coop. So Mackie and his new wife basically lived in a renovated chicken coop. And I think it was about maybe 500 square feet, if it was that. You know, he didn't have much money, and probably the money that he was getting from selling some drugs or something like that. And I shouldn't be smiling about that, but again, it was just kind of that resiliency of, you know, Mac kind of always kind of found a way. And again, whenever I talked to him, or we would go down, you know, we would drive down and visit him at this point, and we had our licenses, and we'd drive down, and he was, you know, again, oh, this is okay. You like my house? Isn't this cool? So finally, Mac kind of got a break, and he always was kind of musical, and you could see in those pictures he was doing what he loved to do best. I'll pop them up again. Doing what he loved to do best, which was play music. So here he is playing his guitar. A little later on, this wasn't when he was 18. But anyway, so he he got together with a couple guys and they got a little band together and they got a gig and they were playing pretty regularly at this little bar, again, out in the middle of nowhere in New Jersey. And so we went down and couldn't see the pictures. Okay. You know, let me do this. Now you go, Sam, I think. There we go. Can you see those now? Should be able to. So here's Mac. Like I said, looks a little bit like Willie Nelson, doing what he likes to do best. So he got this gig and he was playing and he was making a little money and he was pretty excited about that. So one night they're coming home from the bar and the guy that was driving, Mac wasn't driving, Mac was a passenger. And I don't know all of the details of it, but they rolled the car over and it was a pretty serious accident. And Mac's leg was pinned under the dashboard and he ended up having to lose his leg. So at this time, he's probably in his early 20s and he loses a leg. And that was the one time that I remember him being a little bit down. And I remember when we went down to visit him shortly after that, and he looked at me and he said, you know what's killing me, Alan, is that I can't run anymore and I'll never be able to run again. He said, that's the only thing that's bothering me. And again, so I'm looking at this guy and here he's got all these things going wrong. And you know, that's the one little thing that bothers him. Well, I guess the bright side of that coin was that he got a lot of money from the insurance settlement. So I think, if my memory serves me right, he got about $100,000, which back in the in the 1970s, that was a fair amount of money to get. And in no time at all, Mac being Mackie and being somewhat, I guess, let's see, what word do I want to use? I guess impulsive would be the word. He goes out and the first thing he does is he buys like the best guitar and he buys amplifiers and he buys the friends in the band musical equipment and he buys some big 4-wheel drive truck. He buys just things that were basically toys. He bought a motorcycle, right? Now he's only got one leg, but he bought a motorcycle. So he spent that money up in no time. So he really, he didn't invest it, he didn't save it, he kind of spent it all. Within a year, he had, I think he had wrecked the truck in the woods. He basically bought the truck to ride around the woods. He wrecked the truck in the woods, and so he was riding his motorcycle and he crashed his motorcycle and broke his stump. That's no lie. He didn't have much of a leg, but what he had, he broke that part of his stump. So again, all this stuff going on in his life, and you still, when you talk to him, he's going, well, yeah, I broke my stump, but I'm still playing in the band. So so as Mac goes through life, he continues to have these ups and downs, but what I always took from this, and especially when I used to talk to some of my younger students, I would say life is going to throw you all kind of curveballs, and you're going to have things that happen to you all the time, and people have that happen all the time. And for people to be happy in life, they have to be able to take that and say, okay, yeah, that's not the best situation, but how can I turn that into something that is a positive thing? And I have to say, it was almost never negative. He was really, really well liked by everybody that knew him. He always, he bounced back from things. When we were in middle school and high school, he was always the most popular kid in town, So that's my first person that I wanted to talk about, was Hugh McMillan Kerr. The second person I want to talk about was the teachers. And since I'm a teacher, obviously everybody always has probably some teacher in their life that makes a difference. And for me, it was my 5th grade teacher, and his name was Mr. Frank Schmidt. And I couldn't find a picture of Mr. Schmidt. I think when I had Mr. Schmidt, he might have been a couple of 3 years out of college. He was a younger man, and he was the type of teacher that he did not accept mediocre performance from anyone. So I lived in a small town, and we had a fairly diverse class. We had some really smart kids, and we had some special ed kids even back then. And so Mr. Schmidt, he would check our book bags as we walked out the door every day. He would go through our book bag, and if you didn't have your math book, he'd say, go back to your desk and get your math book. And he was the only teacher I ever remember doing that. But you might not do your math, but you weren't going to go home without your math book. He was a teacher that he organized his class so that everybody felt important in that class. So one of the things was the whole class was the United States government. So everybody had a role. So we had a president and we had a vice president. And as long ago as this was, I remember I was the Secretary of Commerce, and at the time the Secretary of Commerce was John Connor, I believe was the man's name. Now I should never remember that, but I remember it. And he made each of us write a letter to that person, and most of us, almost all of us, got a letter back. And that was huge. But that was kind of the way that he did things. And one of the things that he did that today he might actually get in trouble for is he had a nickname for all of us. Every one of us had some kind of a nickname. My nickname was just Zube because my last name was so weird. That was my nickname. But other people got nicknames, and some of them that turned out to be their lifelong nicknames. We had a girl, Nancy Kostrub, and he called her affectionately Peanut because she was very small, and she was Peanut for the rest of the time that I knew her. One of my best friends, Bruce, his last name was Woodington, so he called him Woody, and so that kind of stuck, and he was Woody forever after that. We had another guy in there who was his name was Bruce, and he also, and actually another neighbor of mine, and Bruce was kind of tall and skinny, and so he'd call Bruce Stringbean, and for the rest of the time that I remember, he was Bean, and he remained Bean through high school and forever. And today maybe that would, that might not be looked down upon if a teacher kind of developed nicknames for everybody. But we always found it to be, an affectionate thing. We could tell it was out of a warmth, and it was never out of a ridicule in any way. And that was the way that Mr. Schmidt was. He was the head of the safety patrol, so pretty much almost everybody in our class was on the safety patrol, and he definitely instilled in us that this is a huge responsibility, and you have to really take this seriously. And I remember we took it maybe sometimes too seriously. And I remember at one time we noticed that there was this car that was parking on the street across from the school, and it seemed like it was there every day. And so we were in tune to this, and we got excited about it. And so we ran in and told Mr. we think there's somebody over there. He's either stalking somebody or maybe he's going to try to pick somebody up or something. And it turned out it was just some kid's father who parked there to pick him up every day. But we just got so, we were so into our jobs. He had us in tune that, that's what we had to do. And at the end of the year with Mr. Schmidt, we pitched in, and this was a small town. There wasn't a lot of people that had a lot of money, but we all pitched in a couple of bucks each, and we bought them this huge walnut plaque with each one of our names engraved in a plate that was on that plaque, and to the best teacher ever. And we gave that to him, and I remember him crying when we gave it to him at the end of that school year. And I went back to visit Mr. Schmidt probably every year until I graduated from high school, and I'd always go back and I would talk to him for a few days and see how he was doing. And he would always say, "Oh, you guys were my favorite. You were the best class I ever had." And I'm not sure he didn't say that to every class, but it made me feel good for him to say that to us. And it was funny, as I would talk to other people that were younger than me who had Mr. Schmidt, sometimes they wouldn't like him. Sometimes they would say, "Oh, he's too hard, and he's gruff," and because Mr. Schmidt was definitely a teacher that he was firm, and if you needed to be taken to task, you were taken to task. Not ever in a mean way, but definitely in a very firm way. And you knew, I can remember if I forgot to do something or I did something wrong and he had to talk to me about it, I felt bad. I felt like I let him down. And I think that was the power of his teaching, is he made us feel like we were invested. And if we didn't do what we were supposed to do, not only were we letting ourselves down, but we were letting him down as well. So that was Mr. Schmidt. And he had a huge, and I don't know if that's why I became a teacher. I had no intention of becoming a teacher when I left high school. But here I am, and I've been teaching for almost 40 years now. And you have to think that people like that do have an influence on you, and maybe you look back and you say, I think I'd like to be like Mr. Frank Schmidt. Another person that was a big influence about the same time in my life was a baseball coach that I had, and his name was Ed Finnerty. And I couldn't find a picture of Mr. Finnerty either. And he took over when I was a boy. I loved baseball. Baseball was a huge passion for me, but I was very small. I was always one of the smallest kids in school. And I remember my first year in Little League, they changed the age and they dropped it down to 9 years old. So we had 9, 10, 11, and 12. And Little League, well, the 12-year-olds, I mean, they were in 8th grade. They were big guys, and here I was 9 years old, and so we assembled, and Mr. Finnerty was this guy that he never raised his voice, kind of the total opposite of Mr. Schmidt. I remember one of the first practices that we had. He took a baseball and he put it in his hand and he said, "See this, boys?" We didn't have any girls on our team at that time, but he said, "See this, boys? This is a baseball. It weighs," and I don't remember what it weighs, but he told me it weighs this much, and it's got whatever 113 stitches, and it's made of leather, and inside there's a rubber core, and there's string wrapped around the rubber core. And he went all into that, and then he took his glove, and his glove looked like it was from like 1914. It looks like Ty Cobb could have worn it. It was literally, when you put it on the bench, it just kind of melted almost like into jelly. And so one of the things we all said, "Wow, how'd your glove?" It's just like. And so one of the things he taught us was, "Hey, boys, every night you go home and you got to put Vaseline on your glove, and you got to rub it in. You got to treat your glove good. And when you do, it'll get nice and soft, and it'll form to your hand, and you'll be a lot better baseball player." And he always talked to us like in that even tone, always instructional. So about the third practice, he calls me over. He says, "Alan," he said, you're a good fielder." He said, "I think I want you to be my shortstop." And I'm like, I'm 9 years old. I can barely reach first base from shortstop. I mean, it's all I can do to get the ball to first base. And I was like blown away that he, was going to offer me to. And he said, but we have to, we've got work to do. So he said, "If it's okay, I want you to ask your parents if it's okay if you stay after practice for about 20 minutes. And so every day, Mr. Finnerty would hit me 100 ground balls at shortstop, and literally turned me into a shortstop. I played shortstop for the rest of the time that I was in Little League. But he was that guy that was just so, and we were so devoted to him. I had him for 3 years as a coach, and we were so devoted to him as a team that we would have done anything for that man just because we loved him. And that's all, that was it. We loved that man. And I remember one time when we were kids, and I think we were swimming down at the river or something like that, and a kid from another team said something negative about Mr. Finnerty, something about, "Oh, he's not that good of a coach. He's an old man," or something like that. And boy, we chased him home. There's no way he was going to say that about Mr. Finnerty. So that was the type of relationship. And again, it was it was trust. It was the way that he taught us things. One of the things that he really taught me and developed, I ended up being a pretty good hitter because of it, was he always said, "Alan, you're taking, and people always say, "You keep your eye on the ball. You got to keep your eye on the ball." But he was the first one to tell me, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to start watching that ball when the pitcher first puts it in his hand, and I want you to watch it as he, puts his hands up in the air, and watch it as he brings his hands down, and watches as he brings his arm back. I never want you to take that eye off that ball. I want it on there every second." And that's what changed me. Once I started doing that, I started hitting like crazy. So he was just such a great guy and a good coach, and I'll always remember Mr. Finnerty. So the last person that I wanted to talk about, to me, is my hero. And everybody has heroes. Some people's heroes would be, maybe an actor, or maybe a famous scientist, or maybe a famous teacher. Some people's heroes are, service workers, like a fireman or a policeman or something like that, or somebody that did something special for him. My hero is my mother. So here's let me try to put this up here so you can see it rather than bring it. So that's Mom. Of course, she's since passed away. She was definitely a cute woman. And I'll tell you why Mom was my hero. My mother was abandoned by her mother, and I might get a little emotional. She was abandoned by her mother when she was 6 years old. Her and her sister were abandoned. And so her father was an Italian immigrant, and he didn't speak very much English. He had pretty limited English. And so when his wife left him, which would have been my maternal grandmother, he decided that he felt like the girls had to have a woman some way in their life. So he moved in with his sister, which was Aunt Juditha. And my grandfather was it was like my mother, very shy, kind of quiet. And Aunt Juditha was kind of the polar opposite of either one of them. She was very brash, loud. And so the first thing Aunt Juditha did was she took all my mother's toys away. This lady's 6 years old, and she takes her toys away and says, you have more important things to do than play with toys. So when you come home from school every day, she would have a list of chores that she had, cleaning chores, and even cooking chores that she had to do every day. And she was never allowed to really enjoy her childhood because of that. And she lived there with Aunt Juditha, I want to say, until she was about 12 years old. And basically she was the housekeeper. Aunt Juditha worked and Grandpa worked. And so that's what Mom did. And her sister, by the way, was actually sent off with a kind of a foster family. And actually, in reality, had it better than my mom did. But so she's separated from her sister. She has no toys. She's basically coming home from school, doing chores. She really didn't have any friends. Finally, Grandpa did pick up and moved, and they moved to the town actually where I ended up growing up, which was Delanco, New Jersey, and Riverside, New Jersey, in that area. And so she started high school. And my mom was a pretty good athlete. She was good on the track, and she was good at field hockey, but she couldn't play any of those. So she would do them in phys ed class, and they would say, "Hey, you need to come out for the team." And she'd say, "Yeah, let me ask my father." And then my grandfather he wouldn't sign the forms. He'd say, "No, I really," he was, and I don't think it was out of meanness in any way. He just felt like that he needed her at home. And so finally he met a woman and remarried when my mother was about 17. And she finally got some freedom in her life for the first time. And I always considered that woman, who was my grandmother, was my step grandmother, but I always considered her my grandmother. We called her Grandma Carrie. And she really was the person that kind of, number one, opened my mom up a little bit to be a little less shy. And also, for the first time, had some freedom. And so in that period there, she eventually met my father, and that would have been kind of right before World War II. And shortly after they got married, he got sent off to Europe, and so he was in Europe for 3.5 years. And when he came back, they settled and started to have children, of which, of course, I was the third child. So my father was an alcoholic. And so one of the things that my mother had to do when we were young was she was always the buffer between me and my father. And he wasn't a violent alcoholic. He didn't hit us. He didn't do anything like that. But he verbally abused us in a lot of ways. Whenever we did something, not even necessarily wrong, but if we did something that didn't kind of match with the way he thought, and if he had been drinking, a lot of times he would get into some pretty serious verbal abuse situations. But she was always the buffer. She was always the one there that would get in between and kind of take the brunt of it. And I didn't even realize that until much later in my life, how much that she did that for us. She always kept our life, on a very even keel. She was a very loving woman, but you also knew where your boundaries were. She wasn't afraid to give us a little smack in the back of the shoulder that was actually worse than anything my father did to us. Again, probably because we felt like we let her down a little bit. So that doesn't sound, her childhood was really tough, and then she has an alcoholic husband who she never left. They were together until he died. But then later, when we were growing up, because we didn't have a lot of money, she had to take a second job. She had to take a job, and so she was working outside the house probably from the time I was about in third grade. And at the time, she was working as a seamstress, and she had really, really bad arthritis. And I remember her coming home from work and just literally crying because her hands hurt so bad from doing the sewing. But she kept that job. Eventually, she got a retail job, and that was a big help. But when she was about so right after I went away to college, she contracted bladder cancer, and so she had to have her bladder removed, and that was a really hard time for me because I couldn't be there. I was away, and I couldn't be there to help her. Luckily, my sister was close and helped her out a lot. And she ended up with a colostomy bag, and so again, life changed for her significantly as far as quality of life, but she never let it change her attitude or her demeanor or anything like that. And so she lived with that until she was 85 years old, and all that time through my childhood, through my young adulthood, when I became an adult, when I eventually got married and I had my kids, she was just such an anchor in my life, someone who I could always depend on and somebody I could always go to and trust to be there for me. And always thinking back again to the difficult times that she had as a child and a young adult, and then later in her life, that's what makes her my hero, because she got through all that. And she never complained. She didn't leave my father. She didn't abandon us in any way. And to me, that's what a hero is really about. It's somebody that you can look up to and you can hold up. You can hold up that person to somebody and say, "There's my hero, and here's why." And so my mother is my hero. So I appreciate you listening to my story. Probably a little different maybe than what you expected. I hope it's not my last lecture. I hope I've made more to go. But I really appreciate you being here and listening.